And welcome to the International News Daily Report. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Subscribe to our channel to stay in the loop and join our growing international community. Now, our story today is going to focus on a gentleman known as F.W. de Klerk. For those of you familiar with South African history, you know of F.W. de Klerk. Now, the way of which you know of him is actually contentious. Some people view him as South Africa's last apartheid president, and some people view him as the president to end apartheid in South Africa. Now, both are fundamentally true, but both are very different when you really think about them. They are the same exact thing, but their implications and what they mean and how this man is remembered are two very different legacies. And when an important political figure dies or retires or leaves their public office, on our channel, we like to analyze their legacy. Analyze what they've done, the contributions that they've made to their countries and the international community, and the historical importance of their lives. Also, we like to talk about how they will be remembered by their people and the international community at large. So let's get into what is a very, very complicated, debatable, and contentious legacy that is F.W. de Klerk's. Now, F.W. de Klerk was a career politician in the National Party, which for those of you familiar with South African history, enough of it at least, know that the National Party was the leading party during apartheid, and it was the party to introduce apartheid and enforce apartheid. Now, I don't have to go into the details of apartheid, and maybe one day I actually will make a full episode dedicated to it, but it is very complicated, dynamic, and complex. But what should be known is that it was the darkest, one of the darkest moments in modern history in terms of racial discrimination and in terms of general segregation. I'll give you a general run-through of apartheid without going into details. Apartheid were a series of laws to separate black and white South Africans. Now, also some other minorities were separated, particularly mixed people of mixed race who were determined as coloreds and people that came from Asian or Indian backgrounds. So you had different classes of races. You had whites, you had blacks, you had Indians or Asians, and you had coloreds, which were mixed race individuals. And depending on these races, people were put in different classes. Now, as the National Party stated, and as de Klerk defended until almost the very, very end of his life, that the intention of apartheid was not to subjugate or dominate one race or one group. According to the National Party, the goal of apartheid was to develop each South African race separately, independently, and segregatedly. But the reality was much, much different. Apartheid had laws that did not allow interracial marriage. Not just interracial marriage, but interracial sex was a serious crime. Apartheid also put many black people into different, nominally, so in name only, independent nationhoods or neighborhoods where they could only live and they couldn't live in specific other areas based on their tribal ethnicity. And what it led to was white individuals, white people in South Africa who were a major minority in the country, controlling most of the land, most of the financial resources, and all of the political power, at least in terms of legislation. There was multiracial voting was something that was not introduced until F.W. de Klerk did so. It was not allowed, which meant that the white minority, who are the minority in South Africa, ruled the country, despite being the smallest group there. Now we enter F.W. de Klerk. This is a gentleman who had a career as a politician, and he was a member of parliament of the National Party during apartheid. In addition to this, he served in a flurry of ministerial positions, including Minister of the Interior. So he was the director of the police during apartheid. Now, F.W. de Klerk, who is still the person to end apartheid, is considered by many to be an apartheid apologist or a person who is just trying to change with the times. But as F.W. de Klerk stated, that in the early 1980s, he had a change of heart, a genuine change of heart, where he felt that apartheid was evil, that it was hurting a lot of people, that it was killing people, that it had to be changed. And when F.W. de Klerk became president, was elected president of the National Party in February of 1989, he stated that South Africa will become a country that does not dominate or oppress any single racial group. And of that same year, in 1989, in September, he would become president of South Africa. Now, he became president of South Africa during some very tumultuous times. The late 1970s and the 1980s were times where the National Party, who created apartheid, was attempting to make some changes to apartheid, some reforms to give Asian and Indian minorities some form of political rights so they could represent themselves and have a political presence in South African politics, while also trying to create a black South African middle class. Now, the reality is while they were trying to make progressive changes to apartheid and give minority groups more rights, this actually upset people. If you're going to give anyone any rights, give them all of the rights, give them equal rights. And this caused a lot of major tensions at home. Violence was occurring in South Africa on a very regular occurrence. And I'm not talking about just normal in the street violence. I'm talking about massive protests and fights in the streets of gigantic groups. And in addition to this, South Africa, because of apartheid, was essentially an international pariah. When F.W. de Klerk took over South Africa as president, he inherited an economy that was dying because it was sanctioned by the international community because of apartheid. And South Africa has historically been a wealthy country with a solid economy that was dying because of these international sanctions caused by apartheid. So F.W. de Klerk came into office in 1989 as president and is seeing all of these terrible tensions occurring because of apartheid, both at home and abroad. And he realizes that maybe it was the time for change. And on February 2nd of 1990, F.W. de Klerk stated that Nelson Mandela would be freed from prison. And Nelson Mandela was the most prominent member of the African National Congress, which was the most prominent fighter against apartheid, and today is pretty much the major political party in South Africa. He would state the release of Nelson Mandela, who had been serving 27 years in prison. And Nelson Mandela is a very well-known individual as a Nobel Peace Prize winner, which is actually interesting. But we're going to get into that, and we're going to answer why that's so interesting a little bit later in the podcast at the end of it. Now, he stated that Nelson Mandela would be released. In addition to this, other political parties that were previously banned and were illegal, like the African National Congress, would be allowed. And that South Africa was entering a period of transition to full democratization, where every race could vote equally in the elections. Now, this upset a lot of white South Africans because they were the minority. And if the majority can vote and the majority is black and people are voting along racial lines, not political lines, they're voting along racial lines, the reality is you're not going to be in full power anymore. And also, a lot of white people benefited off of apartheid. They received very cheap land. They received massive access to great resources. They had better educations. They just had a better start in life than blacks and other people in the country. And this upset a lot of people. However, it made a lot of other people happy. And this would actually cause even more violence in the streets. In 1993 alone, 3,000 people died in clashes in the streets over the end of apartheid in South Africa. Now, the end of apartheid was painful. People were fighting in the streets. People were protesting. People were killing each other. And a lot of violent actions occurred against both black South Africans and white South Africans. And that was because of F.W. de Klerk's statement to release Nelson Mandela from prison and the statement to end apartheid and introduce a transition to full democracy. A lot of people died because of that. But de Klerk, even while South Africa was having this very difficult transition, stated that the path is tough, it's difficult, and it's bloody, but it's the right path, and it is the only path to peace and democracy. And he's actually right. The reality is if de Klerk did not put South Africa on a trajectory to end apartheid, eventually the country itself would have ended up in a racial civil war, and that would have been a nightmare. Now, finally, we get back into Nelson Mandela, which is a really interesting character here. F.W. de Klerk is officially, legally speaking, technically speaking, the individual to end apartheid, to release people from prison because of apartheid political actions and protests, to allow anti-apartheid parties and multiracial parties or black parties to be legal in South Africa, to allow them to have an election in 1994 where all blacks could vote. He was the individual to legally and technically do this. But the person that gets all of the credit is Nelson Mandela, who was in prison for his actions, and he did a lot to end apartheid. That is absolutely true. And Nelson Mandela, in the elections that were completely democratized and black people were allowed to vote for the first time in the elections created by F.W. de Klerk, Nelson Mandela would become the first post-apartheid and first black president of South Africa. Now, this entire transition period was pretty much created by negotiations, which were led on one side by de Klerk and on the other side of Nelson Mandela, who was representing the African National Congress. And these two, most people in the world know that Nelson Mandela is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. He's probably the most famous Nobel Peace Prize laureate, in fact. But what they don't know is he didn't win this award individually. He won this award separately. This was a shared award. The Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk together for their work to end apartheid and fully democratize South Africa, to allow black people to vote. And that they did. It was a violent and difficult path, but it happened. Nelson Mandela would become the first black president of South Africa in 1994. De Klerk would no longer be president. They were still political opponents. While Nelson Mandela and de Klerk were working together to transition South Africa's economy, that doesn't mean that it was a very pleasant time for both of them. Life is not a Disney movie, and the reality is things can be really difficult. Both Nelson Mandela and de Klerk, during the period of transition, had a lot of animosity towards each other. These were difficult negotiations. These were absolutely terrible negotiations that ended multiple times on both sides, where individuals were having shouting matches with one another. But they managed to work it out. And after Nelson Mandela would be elected as the first president of South Africa, post-apartheid, de Klerk would become his deputy president, and they would work together. But they still had some bad blood between the two of them. Now, 2 years after 1994 and 1996, the National Party would leave the coalition with Nelson Mandela, and F.W. de Klerk would leave the position of deputy president, and he would pretty much leave political life after that point. After his presidency and deputy presidency, F.W. de Klerk would run a foundation that would protect and promote his presidential heritage and his presidential legacy. And he would fight and defend and speak on Afrikaner culture, white Afrikaner culture, which was kind of being deteriorated after the post-apartheid period, especially linguistically. English has essentially been dominating the language, becoming the main language in South Africa after apartheid. For whites, it was primarily Afrikaner. And that language has been slowly dying, and he's been fighting to keep that language alive and Afrikaner culture alive. In addition to this, the Nelson Mandela relationship actually has a happy ending. F.W. de Klerk and Mandela would eventually become friends, and they would completely reconcile their differences, and they even visit each other's home. They used to visit each other's homes on a regular time before Nelson Mandela passed away. Now, this actually on paper seems like a really good legacy. However, many people in South Africa view F.W. de Klerk as a tool and instrument of apartheid and an apartheid apologist. And a lot of his quotes later on in life did not help him. He continued, decades after his presidency ended and after he personally ended apartheid, to defend the purpose of apartheid, which again was to give separate but equal development to different racial groups. Now, separate but equal never works. It never fucking works. It didn't work in any country that used segregation. But he still defended this goal. Eventually, he would publicly apologize for this and say that he was wrong. In addition to this, not too long ago, around 2012 or 2013, F.W. de Klerk stated that apartheid was not a human rights violation, which was an extremely controversial quote and caused a massive fury in South Africa, which he also eventually apologized for. But these quotes did not help him, and his legacy is generally viewed in South Africa as being an instrument, as I mentioned before, of apartheid and an apartheid apologist. And it's a little upsetting because the work and effort that de Klerk put in is just as equal, if not more significant, than the work and effort put in by Nelson Mandela to end apartheid. And both of these gentlemen won a Nobel Peace Prize because of it. But only one of them, only Nelson Mandela, is remembered as the person to end apartheid. And only he is remembered as the Nobel Peace Prize winner and is idolized today as one of history's most peaceful and important icons. But most people outside of Africa don't know who de Klerk is, and those that know him probably have a negative opinion of him. But that doesn't change the fact that this man, no matter what his motivations or intentions or beliefs were, did end one of modern history's darkest and worst periods, which was apartheid in South Africa. Now, he's so controversial that even after death, he still received a lot of attacks and a lot of anger. Many people have stated that he doesn't deserve a state funeral because of his role in apartheid. And finally, I want to state that it's not just blacks in South Africa or anti-apartheid South Africans that have a negative opinion of de Klerk. Many pro-apartheid white Africans, white South Africans, despise him for ending apartheid. And they view him as a race traitor. And they view that he ended what they felt was a good system. And, you know, when we talk about someone's legacy, and when we're talking about de Klerk's legacy, it's not just important how we remember them. Their memory and how we reconcile with it and how we consider it can have implications for the future. Today, South Africa finds itself with having just as much racial tensions as it did in the past. No longer are the days of reconciliation and nation building and unsegregation of Nelson Mandela here. Today, racial tensions between whites and blacks in South Africa is just as high as it ever was. Many white South Africans have no idea and have no sympathy for the extreme poverty that many black and other minority South Africans live in, while many black South Africans have never held more uncompromising, more aggressive positions and more animosity towards white South Africans. And while the nation isn't necessarily heading towards a civil war, these racial tensions are not what Nelson Mandela and they are not what F.W. de Klerk fought for and what they stood for. So as we remember him and as we choose how we remember him and our opinions of him, we should remember that this is a man that worked together with the other side to end one of history's darkest periods. But that's what I think. Clearly, this man is extremely contentious and extremely controversial. But I want you to let me know what you think about him in the comments. Let's have a conversation about de Klerk's legacy and, more importantly, the future of South Africa and racial tensions in the country. In the past, they were managed to be reconciled and they were managed to be mitigated. But today, will that be possible, or will things just get worse in terms of tension between the races in South Africa? Let me know what you think. Subscribe to our channel. Like this video, dislike this video. Again, comment. I'll see you next time.